John, but I bowed for you. So. Oh, man. You got to have a little humor in life, don't you? This is a mean joke, but I'm going to say it anyways. Because it just popped into my head, and so I have to say it. But you know how I know God has a sense of humor? Just look around, right? No. Oh, that's a tough way to start, isn't it? But maybe I can only go up from here. If you start really low, you always set expectations as low as possible. That way you always exceed expectations. That's a great motto for life, isn't it? But to the subject at hand, ever since I was young, since I was a kid, the reason people do the things they do has been something that's always kind of fascinated me. Whatever that is, the reason people wear the kind of clothes that they wear, you'll see people and you'll say, why did they, of all the things that you can wear, why did they choose to wear that? Or the food that people eat, or the things they buy, the things they do, the places they go. And it's always interested me because so many of those things are usually not in our own best interest, right? The things we choose to do, the things we choose to eat especially. But beyond that, by far and away, the most intriguing question of all to me, and the reason I've spent so much of my life studying theology, is why people believe the things they believe. That's the most astonishing of all. And as I considered the focus of today's sermon, I was reminded of a conversation I once had with a former pastor. Now, when a pastor and a pastor are having a conversation, it's usually pretty interesting. But it was a man that had been in ministry for over 40 years, who once asked me a question that's always kind of stuck with me as we were talking about religion and we were talking about religious people. He said, "You want to know what the most shocking part of ministry is?" And I was like, well, of course, right? Someone that's been in ministry that long. There's so many things that are shocking about ministry. What could possibly be the most shocking part of all? And he said to me with all sincerity, the fact that every week without any prompting, although no one's legally obligated to come to church, although no one has to come to church, right? They still wake up every Sunday morning, they put on their clothes, they get in their cars, and they walk through those doors. That's the most shocking part of ministry to him. It's kind of an odd thing for a pastor to say, right? But why would he say that? Why would he say such a thing? Or more importantly, should I say, what do he mean by that? How is that the most shocking part? It wasn't because he was a terrible pastor. He was a really good pastor. He was a very successful pastor. But the reason he said it, as I kind of plugged away at the answer, was because he knew there were people who would diligently, who would faithfully come to church every Sunday, who would wake up every Sunday morning, eat their Sunday breakfast. You got to have a good, healthy start, right? Put on their best Sunday clothes, drive to church, walk through those doors, no matter what, rain, sleet, or snow. When those doors were open, you could count on them. You knew they were going to be there, to the point where if they weren't there, you're like, what in the world happened? So-and-so wasn't there, And yet, in every other aspect of their lives, there's no sign of a redeemed life. That was the shocking part. Because their faith, when it came down to it, was nothing more than superficial. It was just something that they did, like the clothes they buy, like the food they eat, without ever giving it a second thought. That's what God is to them. That's what the faith is to them. And I don't know about you, but to me, that's a pretty sobering reality. And that's the idea that we come to in 1 Samuel chapter 28 today. And we're going to begin in verse 1 with the story that not only makes you ask the question, why do people do what they do? Why in the world does Saul do what he does here? But it's a passage that, in my opinion, it's not only one of the most important scenes of this book, but also one that asks one of the most important questions of this life. On what is your faith based? Have you ever even considered it? On what is your faith based? Is it based on a love for God? Is it based on a truly heartfelt conviction? Or in the end, is it nothing but a superstition, a superficial faith? So it's a sermon which I have entitled The Dangers of Superficial Faith. And this morning we're going to look at what I'm calling 3 painful realities of a superficial faith. I could say your faith might be superficial if, right? For a superficial faith is a faith without God. It's a faith without meaning. And lastly, it's a faith without hope. So let's look at this. You can follow along in your outline. Beginning with our first point, a superficial faith is a faith without God. So imagine, if you will, you're reading through 1 Samuel for the very first time. You've never read this book before. You have no idea how things are going to turn out. Following the ups and downs, the triumphs and the tragedies, all the things we've been looking at for the past few months. When you finally come to the end of chapter 27, do you remember how it ended last week? A chapter that's ultimately about the failure of the hero, right? This guy that we've kind of lifted up as the prime example of what the faith should be, and he completely fails. That's what the chapter 27 is about, his failure to trust in God. But as this story comes to an end, David comes to this crossroads, right? We read in verse 1, 28 verse 1, in those days the Philistines gathered their forces for war to fight against Israel. And Achish, this king, that David's living with, said, understand that you and your men are going to go out with me in the army. You don't have a choice in the matter. I've been protecting you. I've been harboring you all this time, but now it's your moment to pay me back. It's your moment of truth. The battle lines have been drawn. We're about to fight against Israel. If you want to continue to live in Philistia, if you want to continue to have everything that I've given you, you need to understand you're going to have to fight against your people, right? After all, that's what Philistines do. What do Philistines do? They fight against Israelites, right? They're doing it to this day. So we read verse 2, that David said to Achish, very well. You got to love David. You shall know what your servant can do, right? David says to Achish, you know what? You're right. It's about time you see what I can do. It's about time you see why they sing songs about me, right? Unfortunately, the songs about David were about him murdering people, right? Unfortunately. And Achish says to David, kind of the second half of verse 2, very well, if that's the case, if you're really that good, I'm going to make you my bodyguard for life. It's kind of a gut-wrenching scene, isn't it? When you consider David and where he's come from and who Achish is. And here David is faced with 2 possibilities. And that's kind of where we ended last week. Neither one of them are a very good option. He can choose to go out and fight with King Achish. He can fight against his own people, the people he had sworn to protect, his own family members even, right? And basically become enslaved to King Achish, his personal bodyguard, because as soon as he fights against Israel, they're never going to take him back, right? He's going to be a traitor to his own people. Or he can return to the land of Israel, to a land of persecution, to a land of struggle, where he's a wanted man, where he has a bounty on his head. That's his only 2 options. Kind of a lose-lose situation for David, right? So as you're reading this story, I love this, as you're eagerly awaiting for David's decision, out of nowhere, the writer sees a rabbit, right? And he starts chasing the rabbit. Look at what he does. The story's interrupted by these words. Okay, David, what are you going to do? What are you going to, which side are you going to choose? Verse 3, now Samuel had died. What does that have to do with anything, right? And all Israel mourned for him and buried him in Ramah, his own city. Not only did we already know that, why is he bringing it up again? And Saul had put the mediums and the necromancers out of the land. Okay, it just got even more random, right? So it's kind of like this. It's kind of like in the middle of your TV show, your favorite TV show, when all of a sudden it's interrupted, during storm season. They interrupt it for the special news bulletin. Something's happening. Except this time they interrupt it and they say zombies have invaded downtown Wichita Falls, right? It's something really crazy, something that's really out there. Except this, it may even be more random. Even more random than that. Think about this. Think about it exactly how it is. The story of David, it's interrupted by 2 things. A reference to Samuel's death and this random fact that Saul had ran all the necromancers, all these spiritists out of the land. kind of makes you wonder what in the world's going on here. What was the writer drinking when he wrote this? But there is a point. As always, there's a point. For as we quickly approach the end of this book, we're getting very close. We got like 3 weeks left in this book. We're once again, or should I say, we need to be once again reminded about what the book's all about. And what is the book of Samuel all about? If you can't remember by this point, then I've already lost you. We'll start over, like I said, on our books of the Bible. We're going to start over in chapter 1 next week. It's about rivalries, right? That's what it's primarily about. And it's through these rivalries that we encounter some of the most significant points of the book. And even though there are several rivalries throughout the book, none is greater, none is more prevalent, and none is more important than this rivalry between David and Saul. And that's the greater rivalry, the greater comparison, which the writer is drawing our attention to here. It's the story of David at one of the most critical points in his life, you could argue, right? Is interrupted by a random and obscure reference to 1 Samuel. And this abolition of the Spiritists. But what's the point? Why does he do it? That's the important point, right? If David and Saul are being contrasted here, what's the distinction the author's trying to make us see between David and Saul? Well, as soon as the writer gets our attention with this random reference in verse 3, now that I have your attention, I'll tell you what. Verse 4, look at what it says. The Philistines assembled and came and encamped at Shunem. And Saul gathered all Israel, and they encamped at Gilboa. And when Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. And when Saul inquired of the Lord didn't answer him, either by dreams or by Urim or by prophets. God was nowhere to be found. Part of that could have been because he killed all of the prophets, right? Do you remember that? A few scenes back. And that's where I think we get to our aha moment of this book. The greater point to this whole story. See, David and Saul, they're both in terrible straits. If you want to say that, can you still say that? That's kind of an old saying, isn't it? They're both in desperate and life-threatening situations. Both David and Saul found themselves between a rock and a hard place, but what's the distinction between them? Unlike David, Saul is completely alone. Saul's completely lost. He's completely hopeless. He has no one to turn to because unlike David, Saul was without God. And that's the tragic reality of superficial faith. For even though it carries all the outward signs of the real thing, right, of true faith, even though it has the illusion of real faith, in the end, it's a faith without God. It's a faith without His voice. It's a faith without His protection, His provision. It's a faith without Him. And there's no situation in life that's more desperate, more futile, and more alone than that. And that's why this scene's interrupted. You don't interrupt someone's TV show to tell them something that's less important than what they're watching, right? And that's the case here. David, yeah, he's in a bad spot, right? He's at a critical time, but not nearly as critical as Saul, because Saul is apart from God, right? In the end, that's what a superficial faith is. It's a faith without God. But sadly, in Saul, we find a picture of far too many within the church today. Those who want to walk the line. You ever wanted to walk the line? Or sit the fence, or whatever you want to call it? Those that want to live life their own way. Those that want to live without any regard for God or His Word. That is, until something changes. Until they get desperate, until there's a problem or a situation or a storm that's too big for them to handle. And then all of a sudden God's important. When they blow the whistles in Hawaii and say a nuclear bomb's coming your way, right? All of a sudden, hey, God sounds pretty good, right? Then all of a sudden they need Him. But here we see that if that's what God is to you, when it comes to your moment of desperation, He's not going to be found. God's not your genie in a bottle God's not your emergency contact when things get bad. That's not how He works. And the harsh reality is if we continue to live our lives in a disobedience to Him, ignore His word, ignore Him in our lives, if we continue to go our own way and do things the way we want, and only seek Him when we need Him, only seek Him when we're desperate, when things are too hard for us, one day you're going to wake up just like Saul. You're going to have something that's far too great for you to handle. You're going to turn to God. You're going to run to God, kind of like Samson when he shook himself, right? Because he was surrounded by his enemies. You're going to realize that God's not there. For a superstitious faith is a faith without God. That brings us to our second point. A superficial faith is a faith without meaning. So, in the absence of God's voice, what does Saul do? Saul does what Saul has always done. We kind of resort to our go-to methods. And what is Saul's go-to method? Take care of it himself. We read verse 7, Then Saul said to his servants, Seek out for me a woman who is a medium, that I may go to her and inquire of her. And what do you know? Even though they had been banished, think about this. His servant said to him, Oh, we'll have to go and look and see if we can find one, right? No. Behold, there's a medium in Endor. We know exactly where one is. Now, how do you know exactly where one is? I think that says a lot about the people that Saul was hanging out with. So he decides that if God's not going to work in his time, if God's not going to work in his own way, he's going to find another way, right? He's going to find a way outside of God. It's really the story of chapter 13 all over again. You remember what he did there? God, when you didn't answer, when Samuel didn't show up, I forced myself, right, to make a sacrifice. So Saul charges his servants with this task, and they immediately, what's the chances, know exactly where one is. So we read verse 8 that Saul disguised himself. He put on other garments. I like what that says. What does that mean? He's saying something without saying anything. He put on non-kingly garments, right? He divested himself of his kingliness, of these garments that represented who he was. How telling is that, right? And he went, he and 2 men with him, and they came to the woman by night. The author presents it as just as sketchy as it is. They go to this woman in the night, and he's pretending to be something other than what he is. But in reality, in doing that, he becomes exactly what he's pretending not to be. Does that make sense? I would say it again, but I don't think I can. So look at what he does. In order to consult this woman, this spirit that he had outlawed because it was against God's law, he has to divest himself of his kingly attire, which is telling enough on its own. But he goes to her secretly in the night, and in one verse, you wouldn't think one verse would be so informative, we see the totality of why Saul is rejected as king. Why God had hidden himself from Saul in the first place, because Saul has no concern for God. He has no concern for what's right. He has a concern for one thing, his way, right? And he's going to hold on to his way, and he's going to hold on to the pretense of being a good Christian, a good king, for as long as he can. So he journeys to this woman at night, and he tells her, Divine for me a spirit, and bring up for me whomever I shall name to you. That's a nice, polite request, isn't it? But notice, it says even more about Saul. It's all about having things his way. He's going to go to a source that he can control, that he can manipulate. And that's exactly what he does. The woman tells him, verse 9, Surely you know what Saul has done. So he doesn't know who he is yet. How he has cut off the mediums and the necromancers from the land. Why then are you laying a trap for my life to bring about my death? So surely you know it's against the law for me to do what you're asking of me. How do I know that what you're asking of me isn't just a trap? To which Saul replies with, What is the icing on the cake? or what you could say, the final nail in the coffin. Saul swore to her by the Lord. If that isn't bad enough, in Hebrew, the word for Lord there is actually Yahweh. The writer probably didn't want to write Yahweh. Saul swore to her by the name of Yahweh and said, as Yahweh lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing. Now, what does that statement mean to Saul? Nothing, right? It's a story that so painfully illustrates precisely what God had become to Saul. Nothing. Disposable. And even more tragically, what he is to many in the church. Nothing more than a superstition. Nothing more than something that can be manipulated when we need him. Manipulated for our own personal gain. For here as Saul swears by the name of the Lord, as he swears by Yahweh's life, he does it as he seeks a source that Yahweh has condemned. He swears by Yahweh as he lives in disobedience to Yahweh, and in the process he shows that his faith is nothing. His faith is meaningless. But not only that his faith is meaningless, that he's completely lost. Sometimes in life we think that the matters of the heart are trivial. I don't know why we think that when it comes to the faith. Maybe because it's easier to live under that delusion. We think if we're generally good people, if we follow the rules, if we maintain the appearance, if we maintain the illusion of faith, we're going to be okay in the end, right? And here we find nothing could be farther from the truth. The greatest commandment, think about this, in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, according to Jesus Christ himself, is not to hold up the appearance of faith. It's not to keep all the rules. We failed at that already. What is it? It's to love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. Let me tell you this. I hope you'd listen. You can't love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength without it changing who you are. So if that's not the reality of your heart, if that's not the reality of your life, if He isn't your greatest love, your greatest priority in life, if sinning against God and rebelling against Him doesn't grieve you in your heart, you can pretend all you want. You can maintain all the appearances and all the pretenses that you want, but in reality, in my opinion, for what it's worth, you're completely lost. And your faith, whatever you want to call it, you can call it faith, it's meaningless. Because it's nothing more than superficial. It's not the real thing. And that means it's ultimately a faith without hope. That brings us to our final point. The superficial faith is a faith without hope. So, after God refuses to answer Saul, and Saul can't reach him through all the biblically prescribed methods, as this story draws to an end in verse 15, Saul finally finds a way to get his answer, once again by doing things his own way, right? Unfortunately for Saul, it's not the answer he wants. For as he calls on Samuel from beyond the grave, whether it's Samuel or not, that doesn't matter. That's not even an important piece of the story. He gets his answer, but it's not the answer that he wants. He would be cut off from being king. He would be cut off from his own life. And the reason why? He had no place for God in his life, and so God had no place for him. And it's here I think we find the final truth about superficial faith. It's a faith without hope because it's a faith without God. In this life, there's a whole lot of things you can place your faith in. You can place your faith in others. You can place your faith in men. You can place your faith in technology. You can place your faith in science or in money. There's a lot of things you can place your faith in. You can place your faith in all the religions of this world that all have their own way and all have their own truth. You seek God in any way you want, right? That's what our culture wants to believe. But that's exactly what Saul does here. And look at where it got him. But in the end, think about this. Of all these roads that lead to God, only one can be true. There can only be one right answer to 1 + 1, right? It's 1. No, it's 2. It's not up to your own picture of truth. 1 + 1 is always 2. And just like there's only one truth when it comes to math, something so simple, there's only one truth when it comes to salvation. And Jesus said it. He said, I alone am the way, the truth, and the life. There's no other way to heaven. There's no other way to the Father. There's no other way to eternal life but by me. And that's why He died. He died in our place because there was no other way. The only question left is, what way are you going to choose? Are you going to choose to live for Him and serve Him with all your heart, with all that you are? Or are you going to continue to live a superficial life, a superficial faith that's ultimately without God, without meaning, and without hope? Something I want you to think about today as we go to the Lord in prayer. And I pray it's something that you would take seriously. If you would, please stand and let's go ahead and pray. Father, I pray that the truth of this message would burn in our hearts, and that you would help us to see what you desire of each and every one of us. You desire our hearts. You desire our lives. And so today we ask, God, that you would forgive us where we failed you. Today we ask that you would take our lives and that you would use them for your glory. God, we thank you that it's not about perfection. It's not about keeping up the rules. But it is about loving you. Forgive us for failing you in that. And Lord, today I pray for each and every person here. And the storms they may be facing and all the things they may be going through. That you would help them to see you. That you would use the situations of their lives to point them towards you. And that you would help them this day to be all in. Give everything to you. Father, today, if there be anybody here that's never trusted in your Son, we know from the truth of your word they're lost. It doesn't matter how good of a person they are. So we ask that you would speak to their hearts now and you would give them the strength to trust in you. Help each of us. And we ask it all in Jesus' name. Amen. Today, if you would like prayer, I want to invite you to come and you can pray with me or you can kneel